A workshop that was founded by Paul Gregory, a research fellow here, and we are in his great debt for bringing together different and somewhat overlapping groups of scholars for the past 13 years to come and work in the library and archives and look at material while presenting their own work at weekly meetings, which some of you have been to for the good lunches and the conversation. So it's a great use of the archives, and I'm really pleased for that. And as our keynote, we have the only participant in every session of the 13 years of this workshop, other than Paul Gregory, Mark Harrison. So let me say a few words about Mark before he introduces and does his speech. Mark's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a former national fellow at the institution. He's an economic historian and specialist in Soviet affairs. Mark was careful to tell me that he's a professor of economics at the University of Warwick, which is spelled W-A-R-W-I-C-K. To silly Americans like me, we often pronounce it wrong as Warwick. Let me just read something from the bio. In addition to his Hoover appointment, Mark is a senior research fellow at the Center for Russian and East European Studies of the University of Birmingham. He was one of the first Western economists to work in the Russian archives following the fall of the Soviet Union, and he has written or edited a number of books, including Guns and Rubles, The Defense Industry in the Stalinist State, which is published in our Yale Hoover series on Stalin, Stalinism, and the Cold War. He's written The Economics of World War I, Cambridge Press 2005, The Economics of World War II, and has articles in many leading journals. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Harrison, who will do his talk. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you all for coming. I hope I won't disappoint you. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be standing up in front of my colleagues and those who've worked with me and helped me over many years of working in the archive here. So my story begins really in 1972. In 1972, I was a graduate student in Moscow. I was with a bunch of other British students. We were full of curiosity about our environment, the police state. That we knew it was a police state, but what did that mean? Did they care about what we did? Did they follow us? Did they care about who we made friends with, what stories we told, what we learned? We had no idea what the answers to these questions were. I had no idea that 40 years later I'd be finding out the answers here in California, in the reading room of the archive, which is now one of the world's richest collections. Well, it is the world's richest collection of documents, historical documents on totalitarian regimes. Specifically in the collection of the KGB, the Soviet secret police, of Soviet Lithuania. So my story takes place in Lithuania, in Kaunas, which is the second city of Lithuania. In 1972, there was a sudden uprising. You could think of it a bit like the Arab Spring. There was a square, a demonstration. Somebody burned themselves to death. There was a funeral, a lot of anger. But it was quickly suppressed. It went away. All this happened under the nose of the secret police, which had been watching. And there's part of my story is about surveillance, and you know that surveillance is in the news. The National Security Agency, Edward Snowden. But with a difference. This was a security agency in the service of a totalitarian state. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what happened. So one thing is that it came pretty much out of the blue, but maybe it shouldn't have. So we know something about the history of mass disturbances under communism. They were not very frequent, and when they happened, they were typically suppressed with some bloodshed and considerable violence. So from 1939 to 53, there was perpetual warfare in the Soviet Union's western borderlands, where Lithuania is, fought over by Germany, by Russia, and by the inhabitants who rose up against their occupiers and carried on fighting for some years after the war against Soviet occupation. After 1953, things quietened down. It was quiet in the borderlands, but there were uprisings elsewhere across Eastern Europe, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and in Russia itself, a celebrated uprising in Novocherkassk. Also, part of the background is that in 1968 to 70, there was a little, not a wave, but a wavelet, a little ripple of public self-immolations, young men who burn themselves to death in public in Ukraine, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. So you can see a little bit of the background here. But nonetheless, in 1972, Lithuania itself had been quiet for almost 20 years. There are things going on. Churchgoers. The Catholic Church is strong in Lithuania. Churchgoers were arrested. An underground newspaper of the Catholic Church is being circulated for the first time, and the KGB can't suppress it. Also in April 1972, a petition is being collected, a secret petition reaching 17,000 signatures, smuggled out of the country, sent to the United Nations, calling for religious freedom. It's a time when young people are restless. You can think of it. I was a student. I remember those times very well. It was a time of youth culture, student power, flower power, things that grow and can be taken into the body in various ways. And it's drifting into Lithuania across the Baltic from Scandinavia. Pop music, poetry, hormones, all these things are being mixed together in a rather heady cocktail that spreads among young people. But, you know, that's what we know after the event. If you look at it in 1972, the country is quiet. Nothing's much going on. And there's one person who sees it coming. One person. And this is what we find in documents of the KGB's analytical department, dated March 1972. Here are some things we should be studying. Unhealthy phenomena among young people, expressed in the spread of the so-called hippie movement. We should look into this and send a report to the Central Committee. And someone, this is the far-sighted person, has written down, here, they're ahead of us in Kaunas. They're already here. Okay. So that's background. But everybody else, apart from this one far-sighted humorist, is taken by surprise. So here's the young man. So this is it's a very well-known story. There's nothing new in the story. The new stuff I'm going to tell you about is about the KGB responses. So here's a young man, Romas Kalanta, who on a Sunday afternoon in May 1972 went to a public square in Kaunas and set himself on fire. He doused himself in gasoline and he set himself on fire. He died early the next morning in hospital. And this is just a citation from the KGB report of the incident, which is across the courtyard on microfilm. Here's his suicide note. He wrote on a sheet of a diary, "Blame only the regime for my death." But nobody knew this at the time because this suicide note disappeared immediately into the KGB archive. Here's what happened next. There was a funeral, a lot of anger, and young people took to the streets. So here's all the photographs I'll show you are KGB photographs. The KGB wasn't only taking pictures, it was also confiscating cameras. Right? So the only photographs that exist are by the KGB. This is what they did with the photograph. You can see, they thought, let's find out who these people were in the front row. They gave each of them a number, and then they went on to identify them. Here's a few other pictures of there's a couple of days when there were disturbances. You can see a lot of people standing around, a lot of them are young, all looks quite peaceful, it's serious, but it's, we don't see any pictures of fighting. They're in the park, they're sitting around a tree, they're looking sad and sorrowful. So the photos don't tell the full story because the crowd was dispersed. And it was dispersed violently. That is, on May the 18th, the first day of the demonstrations, the police attacked the crowd. There was fighting, rock throwing, running, skirmishes carried on through the evening. So this is an account by Amanda Swain, who's probably the leading historian, I should say the leading English language historian of these events. Around 400 were arrested that day, who I'll come back to in a minute. The next day, more demonstrations. This time they were suppressed by troops and KGB units. The second day there were no arrests, but there was quite a lot of beating. Now, who took part in this? Well, the KGB thought around 3,000 to 3,500 demonstrators. Well, Kaunas is a city with a population of 300,000. So as a percentage of the total population, it's about 1%, which doesn't sound like a lot. But then you think, who were the demonstrators? I'll show you in a minute. They were mostly young men. If you think of young men aged between 15 and 25, that's a much smaller number than the total. Probably around 1 in 6 of the population of young men were taking part. 400 were arrested. That's 1 in 10 of the demonstrators. Most of these, the great majority, were male, young, 15 to 25, in work, school or college. These were not dropouts or unemployed. Most of them had no police record. 1 in 4 of them were members of the party youth wing. So, in other words, normal young people, the sort of exactly the people you'd expect to find on an event like this. Now, there was a phase of punishment. So who was punished and how were they punished? Around 40 of those arrested were formally penalised. That is to say, they were detained in police cells for 10 to 15 days. That's an administrative penalty, around 30 of them. 8 were put on trial and jailed. And they were jailed for between 1 and 3 years on charges of violent disorder. I'm not sure what the American term would be. That's what we'd call it in English. In Russian, it's hooliganism. I apologise to the Irish. Okay, no one was killed, no one was executed. The only death in this was the death of the young man who burned himself to death. Those who they punished formally look exactly like the others, for the most part. That is, they were mostly male, most in study or employment. But they were clearly singled out on some criteria, and these appear to be the criteria. They were singled out from the demonstrators on the first day. They were singled out from those few in the front row that had those numbers in the photograph, and from the few that did have a police record. Okay. What about the rest? That is, other than the 40 who suffered a formal penalty. They received preventive treatment. Okay, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be exactly what that meant. But what this means is that if there were blue-collar workers, they were called in for cautionary conversations. Again, there'll be more detail in a minute, with the KGB and police. They were identified at workplace meetings, stand up, tell us the bad thing you did. Some individual, ill-intentioned violators of labour discipline were demoted or transferred to lower paid work. That's a kind of punishment. School and college students also had cautionary conversations. Many were quietly expelled from their courses. What was the significance of this in terms of politics? Now, officially, the KGB said there is no political significance. Kalanta was a goth. Right? He was obsessed with death and drugs. There was nothing political about it. They took his suicide note and put it in the archive. But the thing is that Kalanta chose a very symbolic location. There's a musical theatre in Kaunas with a park around it, and the musical theatre is where the Lithuanian parliament petitioned to join the USSR in 1940, when the Soviet Union occupied the country. So that's when Lithuanian independence ended. And here it is, you can see it's a beautiful building in a sunny square. So Lithuanians understood this as a very political act. And the crowd that marched were chanting political slogans: freedom for Lithuania, freedom for hippies, right? Lithuania for the Lithuanians. All around the country there were little events in many, many places. Work stoppages, slogans, flags, fireworks, all sorts of stuff going on. And some of this had a darker side. You have a country with a rather tortured past. Not everything that comes to the surface in times of trouble is nice. This is one of, I just think it's interesting in lots of ways. These are railway workers in a railway repair shop. They went to work, but instead of working, they started drinking. The manager came to tell them to go back to work. And this is what they said. They said to him, "Soon we'll turn all the Russians out of Lithuania." I'm not very good at impressions, but imagine I'm a bit drunk. We'll cut some throats. We totally support the Kaunas events. Don't you think this is over? Stalin's time is gone. We've been in prison. We've been resettled. That means sent to Siberia. Now we're going to resettle the Russians out of Lithuania. We'll put on a Bartholomew's Eve. Railway workers, they know about Bartholomew's Eve. Does anybody remember when Bartholomew's Eve was, the first one? Okay, so it's 1572. So this is the 400th anniversary. So I guess there was stuff in the papers about those evil Catholics murdering the Protestants in Paris. That's Bartholomew's Eve. And now these Lithuanian workers are turning it on its head. We're going to have a Bartholomew's Eve. We'll murder the Russians. We demand freedom for Lithuania. Okay. So here's the story so far. In 1972, there's a sudden crisis. There's a suicide in a square, a funeral and a demonstration, which is a bit like the Arab Spring, isn't it? These are the sorts of things that happened in Cairo, in Tunisia, and so on. There's an explosion fueled by these deep grievances. But unlike the Arab Spring, and unlike the other more famous episodes of mass disturbances under communism, it's curbed effectively, quickly. There are no bloody reprisals, there's no mass executions, there's calculated, selective force. And that's it. So you can think, well, for the KGB, of course, the Kaunas events, the fact that they happened was a failure. But the speed with which they were suppressed was a success. The fact that they were suppressed quickly without great bloodshed was a success. And in some ways that's remarkable. If you think about the KGB's fearsome history, that is, it's an organization that in the past, 20 years before, executed millions of people, imprisoned, forcibly resettled tens of millions of people, including many Lithuanians. So the question is, how do they do it? What we're looking at here is a rare case of a secret police doing quite a good job. And that's why I think it's interesting. What do they do when they're doing their job well? Okay, so how can social science help us? Now, I'm a social scientist before I'm a historian. So one of the things I like to think about is, what does my discipline tell me about these events? And I'm going to suggest to you 5 lessons of social science, which I'll just run through quickly. To begin with, 3 lessons for the secret policeman. This is the secret policeman's problem. First, the enemy is in hiding. The second is that it's young people that carry dissent. And the third is a spark can set the whole prairie ablaze. And then there are 2 more lessons that are the secret policeman's solution. The 4th lesson is you can stamp the fire out if you're quick. And the 5th one is you can then build stability on pretense. And these come from particular authors that I'll refer to. So Ronald Wintrobe is a political scientist. Avner Greif is an economist here at Stanford, and with Steve Zedelis at Berkeley. They're economists. Timur Karan's another economist. Mark Granovetter, a sociologist, and Alex Inkelis and Raymond Bauer, also sociologists. So this is a multidisciplinary collection of stuff. And I'll link these lessons to the KGB methods that were in use before and after the Kaunas events of 1972. So first thing, the enemy is in hiding. So a dictator always has enemies, more or less by definition. There are a majority of people who have no say. If they had a say, it would be a democracy. So there's a disenfranchised majority. There are minorities that have been dispossessed or looted or exiled. And these are enemies, but they must hide their true desires. And Ronald Wintrobe describes this as the dictator's dilemma. The more powerful the dictator, the harder his subjects will try to hide their true preferences, their true desires. The harder they'll try to ensure the appearance of loyalty. And even true loyalists had to be very careful not to create the impression that they might be harboring disloyal thoughts. Everybody has to work at this. So what this means is that if there are threats, you know there are threats if you're a dictator, but you cannot hope for direct evidence, so you have to infer the threats from indirect signs. And what you have to do is you had to have a system of screening or profiling. So you screen everything that happens to look for things that might be suspicious. You have to screen all the people who come to you, and those who don't as well, to see who is suspicious. Suspicion is the life of the dictator. So the implication is that the first problem of the dictator is know your enemy. So the question is then, how is that done? And what you have to do then is mass surveillance. Mass surveillance to watch the usual suspects. Okay, remember in the film Casablanca, the police chief goes out to arrest the usual suspects. The usual suspects are the enemies you know. But what you must remember is there are also enemies you don't know, and these are the ones who will kill you. So you have to watch everyone, in fact, which may seem like a hopeless task. But the task is made easy by the fact that the unknown enemies have one common feature that will help you, and that is they're young. So the second lesson from social science is that it's young people who carry dissent. So the question here is, where do young people get their values from? For the older people, you know that they get their values from before the revolution, from the old society, from the old education system, from the church. And it's the older people who are the usual suspects. But the question is, how do young people get their values in a society like the one we're talking about? So you look at these people. Where did they get their values from that led them out onto the street in 1972? There they are. You can look at them. You can see that they're all of them, late teens, early 20s. So he's 25, he's 18. I haven't been able to work out her age, but we know her name. And you can see she's just as young as the rest of them. So where do they get their values from? So this is where Greif and Tardellis' work comes in useful. So let's just start with a series of obvious points. Young people get their values either from their parents or from school. School in the broad sense, chatting in the classroom, teachers, the obvious ways, societies, school clubs, and so on. And one of the things that schools do is to teach values. So if the parent doesn't teach the child values, the child can get them from school. Now, if you're a parent that conforms with regime values, it's not a problem. It doesn't matter. They'll get the same thing from you as they get from their teacher. It's not an issue. But for those who do not conform, there is now a parent's dilemma. And the parent's dilemma is, how do you bring up your children safely? You love your children, you want to hand over your values to them, but you also want to keep them alive and at liberty. And these two things may be in conflict if your values are in conflict with the values of the regime. So the question then is, what is the dissenting parent's best choice for the child? And what Greif and Tardellis suggest is we've got to think about this in two dimensions. So one dimension is, what is the punishment for deviating? Is it mild or is it severe? Mild is a slap on the wrist. Severe is imprisonment or execution. And then the other thing is, what is the risk of exposure? How likely are you to be found out if your child has the wrong values? And if we start with a society in which non-conformism is punished but only mildly, it follows that it doesn't really matter what the risk of exposure is. You love your child, your values are your values, you're going to hand them on. So you hand your values on to your child despite the fact that they will suffer some mild social disfavor as a result. So you bring the child up in your private values, your norms of behavior. The interesting stuff happens when punishment is severe. So you can think to yourself, if punishment is severe and there's a high risk that giving your child the wrong values will lead to them being exposed, your first priority is to keep them alive. So you don't teach your children to have the same religious faith as you, to have the same values. You keep quiet. You let the school do it. The school will do a job and teach the child how to live safely. But what if the risk of exposure is low? Then there's another solution. And the other solution is hidden morality. You bring your child up in the knowledge that we have one set of values at home and a different set at school. At home we believe this, but when you go to school and the teacher asks you, this is what you say. And you train your child to live safely with two sets of values, one which is overt and the other is hidden. And you can expect that to be the case when the family unit is strong, when it's secure against external surveillance and informers. Then hidden morality will be the result, and private values will hide in the hearts and minds of young people until they cease to be afraid. So you can see that the problem in 1972 was a problem of youth. The demonstrators that you saw in those photographs were not a cross-section of Lithuanian society. They were a cross-section of Lithuania's future. Young, usually male, students and workers. So the implication is youth is a problem. The KGB knows who are the old guys, the old leaders of the resistance, the old nationalist leaders. They're the usual suspects. But the KGB also has this problem of the known unknowns, right? That's the young people. So, okay, so that's the second thing. Young people are the carriers of dissent. The third is the idea that a spark can set the prairie ablaze. So this is work that was done some years ago by Timur Kuran, who began by noting that nobody predicts the overthrow of the old regime. So he looks at a series of revolutions, France, Russia, Iran. In each case, at the moment before the overthrow of the old regime, everybody thinks nothing much is happening. So I guess my favorite quote, you can, I'm not going to read them all out, but the Shah's wife. For heaven's sake, who is this Khomeini? So this third lesson is that it's a spark that unpredictably, suddenly, causes a conflagration. But how can a random spark so suddenly set a whole society ablaze and change history? So Kuran argues that under the dictator are many who choose a path of what he calls conditional loyalty. That is, you're loyal on condition, on condition that everybody else is loyal. Okay? Because if everybody else is a supporter, what can you do? You can't overthrow the regime on your own. If everybody else is supporting the government, you might as well go along. It's pointless to speak out, it's pointless to risk everything just to be a martyr, if you really are the only one. And I think a story that perfectly encapsulates this is from a paper by historian Melissa Feinberg a few years ago from post-war Hungary. It's about two sisters, both of whom had been loyal communists. In the early 50s, there were show trials in Hungary. Each of them began to harbour doubts about the regime. But each was convinced that the other sister was still a true believer, and so kept silent, right? Even though they were very close and lived together in the same apartment. So when each person thinks they're the only one to feel alienation from the regime, the importance of the spark is it's a moment of discovery. It's a moment of enlightenment. You look around and you suddenly see, I am not alone. And that's galvanizing and mobilizing. And there's mass resistance. And suddenly it's all over. Which makes it seem like the position of the secret policeman is hopeless, and yet there is still hope. And that's what I'll just go on to. Okay, so the fourth lesson is a fire can start, but you can stamp it out quickly. And here, think about all those troublemakers. Think about those young people on the streets. And when I was a child in the school playground, we got lined up in order of height. It's a similar sort of idea, but here we're not lining people up in order of height, we're lining them up in order of a moral quality. And the moral quality is going to be, call it what you like, recklessness, or maybe courage, or strength of conviction, or impulsiveness, but that's what drives the first person to stand up in the middle of the street and say, I'm against, right? And here's that person. This is the most impulsive person in society, the person who will march in the front of the demonstration, even on their own. Right? Maybe they're crazy, but this is what happens at that extreme. And then next to him comes the person who will join the march if there's one row in front of them. They'll go in the second row, they won't go in the first row, but they'll go in the second row. And then, again, lining people up in order of this recklessness is the third person who will join the march if two rows are in front of them. And then there's a bunch of people who also come along behind. Oh, and then at the end there's me, right, because I'm very cautious, and I will join the demonstration only if everybody else is already there, right? Okay. So that's the full spectrum of society. And the interesting thing about this idea is you can see that it ripples along the line. All it takes is the first guy, and then everybody else gradually joins in. And suddenly, a whole society is on the march. So, how does that help? Well, the way it helps is, think what happens if you break the chain. You can break it anywhere, but think of the second guy. If you take the second guy out of the chain, the first guy will still be out there, standing there alone, but nobody else will join, because the third person requires two people. If you take out the second one, there's only one, he won't take any action. The fourth guy also, and so on down the line. Nobody else will join this line. I mean, better still would be to take out the first guy, the first row. If you take out the first guy, nothing will ever happen, because everybody requires at least one person to go before them. But, I mean, that's very difficult, because the problem is that beforehand, all of these people look alike. You can't tell just by looking at their faces who is more or less impulsive. So the implication of this lesson is watch. Watch all the time. When you need to act, act fast. When do you need to act? At the first sign of trouble. So the fifth and last lesson is about pretense. And this comes from a huge body of work that was done in the 50s with Soviet emigres, the Harvard Interview Project, which gave rise to many classic volumes of research, but one of them was a book called The Soviet Citizen by Inkeles and Bauer. They interviewed thousands of Soviet emigrants, and this is what they concluded. They concluded that Soviet rulers did not appear to expect genuine loyalty from the population. On the contrary, they knew that many people in the population held grievances and would have disloyal thoughts. They knew this. But what they wanted was for them to keep these thoughts to themselves. They were satisfied if everybody would behave nicely. You know, I'm thinking you have your little 3-year-old there who's just beating up the neighbor's child. Full of rage and fury, they're fighting over a toy, and you say, don't do that, be nice. Right? You can be angry, but be nice. If everybody behaves nicely and pretends to be loyal, then this has a striking effect, they concluded. If everybody says, I'm loyal, and here's everybody else saying the same thing, you get an exaggerated picture of actual loyalty. And when everybody was pretending, each might conclude that I'm the only one to feel disloyal thoughts. It must be me that's crazy, right? Like Feinberg's sisters, each of them would think, I have no choice but to get on with things as they are. So the fifth lesson is you can build stability on pretense. A society in which everybody pretends is a stable society. When everybody's pretending to be loyal, each person becomes more likely to show loyalty, go along with the system. In fact, you can build real loyalty on the basis of simulation. But if any person's allowed to reach the point of open dissent, this is a problem. It can unravel. So the lesson is silence the first sign of even potential dissent. Potential, not actual dissent, potential dissent. Stamp on it immediately. The first sign. It demands overreaction. So, to summarize so far, we have these 3 lessons for the secret policeman. The secret policeman's problem is hidden enemies, especially young people, and the danger that a spark can suddenly set society ablaze. But then there are 2 more lessons that are the secret policeman's solution. Stamp the fire out quickly, build stability on pretense. So how did the KGB act on these lessons before and after the Kaunas events of 1972? So this is the last part of what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about information, surveillance, and intervention. So the first part of this is about information and surveillance. That is, this was a template of rule that began with the secrecy of government business. The government ruled in secrecy. Nobody had a right to know. There was no freedom of information. Everything was kept apart from society. Records were a matter of state. So the first thing that the Soviet regime did when it occupied a new territory was to seize private archives and bring them into the state archives, and to turn state archives into secret repositories, because these archives held records of people's pasts. You can use these archives to understand where people have come from and therefore what they might do in future. The media. State media under rigid censorship, almost complete suppression of independent media. I say almost because there were clear failures in this regard. Western broadcasts were not always perfectly jammed. I've already told you about the circulation of underground literature in the Catholic Church in Lithuania. Police registration. So on entering Lithuania, 1940, and again in 1944, chasing the Germans out, the Soviet Union gave everybody a new ID card. It's something that's called passportization, which makes it sound like you're giving people the right to travel, but it's nothing of the kind. It's giving people an ID card, an internal a record of who they are and where they live, requiring everybody to register with the police. You have a mail system, which is a monopoly. There's one mail system, any letter can be opened. You have one telephone system, and any phone call can be intercepted. No international dial-up. Indeed, no intercity dial-up for the entire period of Soviet history. Calls go through the operator. You can dial up within the same town, that's all. Foreign travel. This is a very isolated society. In 1971, 12,000 foreign visitors came to Lithuania. 1,500 went out. Well, I checked how many people visited Lithuania in 2011. Just from the European Union, over 1 million. Right? So this is a society in which people have very little opportunity to travel, to contact themselves, each other, out of the reach of supervision and surveillance. And finally, surveillance itself, a widespread informer network, which was focused particularly on those known unknowns, young people. So you can think, this is a country of 3 million people with 10 to 15,000 informers. That's a lot of people to watch, but they didn't spread them evenly. So here's how they concentrated them. They concentrated informers on places of work and study where young people would be found. So these are figures from late 60s, early 70s. Across the whole country, 120 workers per informer. But then you look at particular kinds of institutions and you find much higher numbers. So to begin with, per teacher. Right? Teachers are important because they hand those values on. So you have to have informers among the teachers. 1 in 70 teachers was an informer. Who are the most unreliable people in society? Right? It's art teachers. Right? So 1 in 5 of the Vilnius Art Institute was an informer. That's the greatest. So these are other educational institutions or research institutions, the Academy of Sciences, music, Vilnius University, teacher training. Right? Teacher training, you see, pretty important. So I found a couple for workplaces. These are both sort of relatively high-tech production. So skilled, educated, growing, so recruiting, and when you recruit young workers. So again, these are places where young people are to be found. Okay, so reports from informers are collated regularly and frequently under these headings, what they call signals. That is, reports of people saying things. Manifestations, that means reports of people doing things. Demonstrations, assaults, and so on. Anything that's abnormal. A fire, a late train, a work slowdown, what's going on? Something's abnormal. Who's behind it? All these things had to be investigated. Who's responsible? What information do we have about the people involved that might compromise them? Are foreigners involved? This was the day-to-day routine of secret police work. The purpose of surveillance, however, wasn't for its own sake. I mean, I think when we look at discussion in the press about Edward Snowden and the NSA and so on, often it appears as if surveillance is done for its own sake. That's never the case. The purpose of surveillance is intervention. And that's how we should evaluate surveillance. What does it lead people to do as a result? So you can think of this as triage. So when there's triage, you divide people into 3 groups. These are going to be the groups. You can either leave them alone, or you had to punish them. And then the 3rd group is the ones you can treat. In medical terms, these would be the ones you can save by intervention. So how did they divide people? Well, it looks like this. You take Citizen Joe. Was Citizen Joe behaving well? In that case, you can leave them alone. That's the easy case. But what if Citizen X is behaving badly? Then it's more complicated, and you have to carry out an evaluation. So suppose Citizen X is in the front row of the demonstration, demonstrating on the first day of the Troubles. Suppose Citizen Joe is one of those ill-intentioned people, a first mover, or someone who, when confronted, won't say, oh yes, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. So unwilling to pretend loyalty, you have no alternative. That person must be punished. But then there's a 3rd group of people. They behave badly once, but only under the influence of others. They're not the first movers, there's a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 10th mover. Moreover, when you confront them, they're willing to go back to pretending loyalty. These people you can save. You can treat them. So what does treatment mean? So I'm going to show you, so the primary method of treatment was cautionary conversations. That means, I'm a colonel in the KGB, please come and have a little chat. We're going to need to talk about your behavior. So the example I'm going to show you is from the same document as the one I've been citing here. So a KGB informer, Andrei, comes to the KGB with a report on a female trooper in the Railway Armed Security Forces who were called Yanina. And Andrei had heard Yanina saying, I sympathize with Kalanta, I support the demonstrations. So here's somebody who's behaving badly, but the question is, what do we make of this? Now, the first thing the KGB did was they needed to protect Andrei. They couldn't just take Andrei's report and act on it. They had to protect him so that Yanina didn't find out who had informed. So they got hold of Yanina's friends, and they got them to find out her views and report them. Okay? And then they called Yanina in to a preventive conversation. And this conversation followed the same pattern that you can find in hundreds of documents over the courtyard over many years. Almost everybody who was called in went through the same process. So first of all, I confront you with your behavior, and you say, I didn't do it. And I say, I know you did it. You did this, 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 and this. So that's then followed by prevarication. Well, you know, I didn't, it may have looked like that, but I was in a hurry, or I was rushing, or something or other. I didn't really mean it. And I confront you again. And finally, then you confess. Yes, that is what I did. So we've gone through denial, prevarication, confession. And then you say, but I didn't realize the harm I was doing. I support the Soviet system. I'm a loyal citizen. I just didn't understand. I'm not very well educated. I'm perhaps under stress. I've been promoted above my competence. Or I drink too much. I know I drink too much. But underneath, I'm a loyal member of society. And I will never, ever do it again. Right? So confession, profession of loyalty, repentance. And when I've heard those words, I will say to you, that's fine, but be sure you don't do it again, or there will be more serious consequences. Move on. And as you leave the room, you turn to me and you thank me for putting you back on the right lines. And when you've left, I make a note in the file whether you're to be subject to further surveillance or not. Do I think we're done with you, or should we continue to keep an eye on you? So that's the pattern. Now, of course, there's the dialogue and what's going on behind it. So what's going on behind it is the subject is aware of several things. First of all, they know everything about me. The second thing is, how do they know everything about me? Because the people around me have told them. I am on my own. And the third thing is, what do? I have no good options. So these people knew that the KGB was not just a police force. The KGB also stood for the employer, the teacher, the admissions tutor, the children's admissions tutor, the authority issuing a passport to travel abroad. The KGB could channel your life from now on. And in living memory also, the KGB had been engaged in mass murder and mass deportations, including of your parents, your uncle or aunt, your relatives. So, following the countless events, the KGB held hundreds of preventive conversations. And 2 years later, as a good organisation does, it carried out a self-assessment. Right? How did we do? And the conclusion they came to was, we did excellently well. How do we know that? Because, first of all, we stabilised society. We not only positively influenced the people who came to us for these conversations, but also it positively influenced those around them. They became more loyal, and because of that, everybody else became more loyal too. So you can think of that as the Inkelism Bauer lesson, the value of pretense. Only 9 out of this 885 people, that's 1 in 100, behaved in such a way that they had to come back again for a second conversation. Right? A recidivism rate of less than 1%. And you can think about recidivism. But by the way, so the first thing here is just to say this is actually replicated by national statistics in the Soviet Union from the same period between, in this sort of 7 or 8 years, 120,000 preventive conversations across the whole country. 1 per 1,000 were followed by serious offending. I don't know what it's like here, but in Britain we have police cautions. Right? If a young person comes in, they've been out of line, they accept a police caution, which means you accept that your guilt, right? And you get a rap on the knuckles. Reoffending, 1 in 6 adults, 1 in 4 juveniles. Right? That's recidivism. So by comparison with that, KGB cautions were astonishingly effective. Why were they so effective? Because this was designed to be effective. It was designed to be a fear-filled, life-changing experience. And to me, this raises a question which I can't answer, which is how much of this was because of memories of the terrible role played by the KGB in the past, which was, of course, fading over time. I mean, 20 years later, it was another generation in the past. I think that's an unsolved question. How much did this effectiveness of this system of prevention rely on the memory of Stalinism? So, what it seems to be the case is KGB prevention actually worked pretty well, worked most of the time. Soviet Lithuania, I think of as like a pan of milk on the stove. It's almost at boiling point, almost all the time. Could boil over at any moment, but nearly all the time it didn't. When it did boil over in 1972, it was cleared up forcefully, but without widespread bloodshed, despite the fact this is only 20 years after insurrectionary civil war. The pan didn't boil over again until 1988, but then it boiled over on a much larger scale, uncontrollably. It ended communist rule. Lithuania became an independent country. So what do secret policemen really do? Well, I want to say to you that although you can find lots of anecdotes about secret policemen losing stuff and getting drunk and not leading a proper way of life, when it came to it, it appears to me that these people were doing quite an effective job. In terms of surveillance, they were ceaselessly vigilant. They knew who were the usual suspects. They also aimed to find out as much as they could about the unknown enemies. When they intervened, they were able to suppress open dissent using a minimum of violence. They were able to discipline the ill-intentioned. They were able to shepherd the lost sheep back to the flock. Indeed, I'm quite sure that these people believed they had the human face of communism. And what that meant was, we don't kill everybody anymore. So, thank you. I've done.
This Chartcast has been a production of the Hoover Institution. I'm Chris Dower. Thank you for listening. For more information about the Hoover Institution, please visit hoover.org.